And it is time for Making Connections. This is our interview segment, of course. And joining us this morning is two-time Pulitzer-winning photojournalist Kang Hyungwon. After an illustrious career with news organizations like the LA Times, the AP, and Reuters, he returned to Korea after retiring. But he's on a new mission: to document the history and culture of Korea through his lens. And this mission is called Visual History of Korea. So we're very excited to talk to him about his experience as a photojournalist and the current project that he's working on. So good morning, Hyungwon, and thank you very much for joining us on Life Abroad.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. So let's begin with, since you are very much associated with photos and images, and that's also related to the brand of Korea, let's start off with where Korea is right now. I think it's kind of like enjoying a heyday as especially the soft power and kind of this trendy power. But it wasn't long ago that Korea wasn't well known. And I still remember growing up overseas when I would say I'm from Korea and they'd be like, where is Korea? Never heard of Korea. And I say, you know, China, you know, Japan, we're kind of sandwiched in between. So having worked for all these news organizations and overseas, you must have noticed a difference in people's perceptions about Korea.
Yeah, Korean culture is very old.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's one of the oldest in the world, except English speakers, for the most part, don't know that.
Right.
They don't know that Koreans were the first to print using movable metal types, which is the subject of my column this week. They don't know that there were people here 7,000 years ago whale hunting. You know, I grew up in the U.S. and, you know, like most Korean Americans, we all have our issues with our identities.
Right.
And I noticed that there weren't too much material that we can learn from American history books about Korea.
Right.
And that's always been a source of a frustration for me growing up. Even at UCLA, where I was studying political science, the professors did not even know why Korea was divided in the first place. You know, it was not an...
Even the professors?
Exactly, because the interest is more on what Chinese and Japanese history, because they were the ones that they were exposed to the English world first. So that kind of frustration has always persisted. And when I was working in the mainstream media for over 3 decades, I would have to basically be a definitive voice when it comes to all things Korean.
Kind of like a public diplomat, right?
Yeah, I mean, not that I wanted, but when I went to work for LA Times, for example, we had more than 1,000 employees in the editorial department. I was the only fluent Korean speaker. So every time a reporter had to go out to interview Korean merchants, for example, convenience stores, I would have to go and help them. Otherwise, whatever that got translated, it did not make much sense.
Right.
You know, so that kind of persisted. But my personal interest in Korean history was back in 1987 when I came to Korea to cover the June 1987 democracy movements. I went to the National Museum and learned all the stuff that I did not learn because I grew up in the U.S. And that kind of motivated me to study Korean history on my own over the years. But, you know, I got married, had 3 boys, been busy raising them, did not really have time to work on areas of my interest. And with my American-born kids growing up, I felt like I need to leave a legacy of some sort of data, some sort of information that they can refer to, what they should be proud of about the ancestors' land. And so I decided if nobody else is doing it, I better do it.
Right. So this history, sort of visual history of Korea, it's been years in the making, kind of like you say. It goes back to maybe 1987 or even before that. As you noticed, there was a lack of material of teaching Korea's rich history to foreigners, basically in English as well.
Yeah.
But in a way, you could have done that by studying, by becoming a professor at UCLA as well. You could have done it in many ways, but you picked up a camera. And I understand that it wasn't something that you actually studied in college as well. So if we can go a little bit back, how did you become a photojournalist? Because that has now become your tool and your trade to tell this history of Korea.
Yeah, I majored in political science and international relations. So obviously this was not area of my studies, but I self-taught myself. And UCLA has one of the few daily newspapers on college campuses. And that's where I got trained throughout my undergrad. And when I won the LA Times internship, which was a national competition, it gave me access to mainstream media as a photojournalist. And that's where I got most of my professional training.
You make it sound so easy, but I don't think it's that easy, right? I mean, to become, to be part of the newspaper, I bet it was also difficult, but to become an intern for the LA Times must have been an even more competitive thing. What do you think? I mean, you said you self-taught yourself, but people must have also complimented you on your photos. What did they say about your photos that was kind of different, or what made them so special?
Photojournalism is basically visual storytelling. Picture has to say something for it to grab a reader's attention. So a picture on a front page of a newspaper has to stop a person from keep walking, for example.
Yes.
So as a storytelling medium, I developed basically how to visually deliver impact along with the information.
How do you do that?
Well, I was trained with the NCAA sports at UCLA. When you do sports photography, the beautiful motion that you capture has a lot to say, right? So that was my entry into photojournalism. And then once I developed my eyes more, I mean, after 40 years, I'm still learning, by the way. It's like people, old writers are still struggling with their prose, right? Yes. So photojournalists, of course, they're always struggling to better their communication skills through their pictures. And it's hard to explain to non-visual people, but what I can say is that when you see a picture and it stays with you, that was a good picture.
Definitely.
Yeah. Some pictures people will remember for a lifetime. Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely those pictures that you did that won you those 2 Pulitzer Prizes. I mean, I think it's an amazing feat to win 1, but for you to be part of a winning team to win 2, that must be very rare as well. Tell us about the moment that you won the first one. This was for covering the 92 riots, right?
Yes.
It must have been very dangerous being in Koreatown at the time. As a Korean-American photojournalist as well, because of your physical appearance, you might have been targeted by some of the rioters as well. What was that experience like? Were you aware of the dangers, or were you just focused on the job?
Being a Los Angeles Times staff photographer does not give you any more protection.
Right. That press sign, not much, huh?
No, not during riots. So I had people chase me with baseball bats. And there were several photographers working for American media that were hurt during the riots. A lot of them lost their cameras. Other people sustained injuries. And I, of course, did my best not to get injured or get killed. There were bullets flying at times. Remember, during the first 3 days of LA riots, there were no police presence in Koreatown.
For 3 days?
First 3 days, no. They kept their line between Koreatown and Beverly Hills on Highland, and they did not enter. So
because it was so dangerous, or they were just kind of, I don't know, what was the reason?
Well, the Koreatown at the time was divided into 2 police precincts, so neither of them took responsibility.
Okay.
And they were basically keeping the riots from spreading into Beverly Hills and let the Koreans handle it on their own. And what Korean Americans did was they came out with their own guns and formed basically a vigilante group to fend off rioters. And so it was a lawless situation, but Koreans handled it as best as they could.
I mean, 92, for a lot of our younger listeners, they may have no recollection of this. I remember this and being shocked by the coverage of it. And on your website, you have the photos, and it looks like a war scene. It looks like a battle scene. You have people behind, heavy equipment with their guns. It's not a scene that you would ever imagine happening in one of the biggest cities in the U.S.
LA riots of 1992 was the most destructive riots of U.S. history.
Yeah.
And Koreans took the most of the blunt of that. And in fact, since 1903, which was the first year when Koreans were immigrated to the U.S., 1992 was when Korean Americans woke up and became a new community. In fact, after the LA riots, Korean American coalition was formed. More people got motivated into going into media, politics, and not just doctors and lawyers. Not that I have anything against them.
Right.
But now that Korean American presence in the U.S., along with the increased, popularity for Korean food, Korean restaurants,
Pop culture.
Korean pop culture,
Yeah.
Korean Americans were reborn after the LA riots of 1992.
And you played a very important part of that. I mean, there's something to be told in prose, in words, but an image, like you say, an image can tell 1,000 stories. It's more than worth than 1,000 words. So
next year is the 30th anniversary of the riots. There was a 25th anniversary LA riots symposium that I went to. And I was listening to some non-Koreans talk about LA riots like it was not. Meaning
that it had not happened?
No, that they were trying to have a revisionist view on it.
I see.
So for me, my pictures will forever tell the stories about what really happened. And
it captured the moment.
Yeah.
Right. We have some listeners, actually. I saw a message from one of our listeners, I think, who had been to your exhibition as well, saying, Chongmin Chongmin, saying it's great to see him again after some 30 years. I've been to his photo exhibition in the late 80s, 1988, I believe. So our listener also knows you as well. So the photos you have on your website, and it's an amazing collection of, like you say, of what happened. You're telling the story through your pictures. But when you received the Pulitzer, did it seem like validation for not only just your work, I guess, but for Korean Americans and all of that? What was that like to receive the prize?
First of all, it was a team award. So LA Times staff, we won the award. And I'm glad I played an important part as the only person who were able to navigate through the Koreatown at the time. But what came out of it was that we had a meeting right after the LA riots with the publisher and the editor-in-chief. And I told them point blank, we need Korean-speaking reporter on the staff. LA Koreatown is way too big for you to not to be having paid enough attention to it until this time around. So after that, they were able to recruit Connie Kang, who is an old friend of mine from San Francisco. And she came to LA Times and she worked there until her retirement.
Amazing.
Yeah. So it did change the Korean American history.
I think the power of images, we see it all the time. I remember that photo of the little boy washed up the migrant. I think that broke hearts and really raised the global awareness of migrants and their situation as well. So the power of photos, especially in this very visual and online world, is so powerful. And I'm wondering, and now we can talk about your recent project, the visual history. It's amazing that you're using all of your experience now to tell the history, to tell the thousands of years history of Korea. And for photojournalists, you have to be there, right? You have to be where the action is happening. How are you doing this, and how are you telling the story of Korea of thousands of years ago, especially during the pandemic? It must be very difficult.
Yes, photographers has to go from point A to point B just to be ready. And 90% of our work is logistics of moving from one place to another, getting ready, waiting for the right light and moment and all of that.
Yeah.
So I'm doing this on my own with my own self-funded project because as a career journalist, I know that when you receive government funding, it becomes a propaganda. It does not have the objective value as history. So I'm doing this on my own. I have a few supporters who visit my website, kang.org, kang.org, and they send me their contributions, which helps pay for the
logistics and all that, of course.
Yeah. I underestimated the cost of living in Korea.
Oh, yes.
The fuel cost definitely is 2 to 3 times more than the U.S. Yeah, so it helps. But until I run out of my funds, I'm going to try to document as much history and culture that differentiates us from the neighboring cultures, so that people have a clearer idea about their own self-identity, about history of Korea, and fact that we've been around for a while.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, you just look at the dolmens, those coin doors.
1,000 years, right?
Yeah, and the Bronze Age, this was a happening place. We got more dolmens, Stonehenges here than anywhere else in the world.
And again, that's a fact that's not really publicized that often, or even that we were whale hunting then. Whales in Korea? Again, I think that's a fact that not a lot of people even know inside Korea as well.
It's carved on a stone.
Right.
Yeah. I mean,
there's pictures of it.
Exactly.
Okay. What do you want to do with this project? Obviously, it's much too important to just have it on your website, I think.
Yeah.
What's the end goal for this project?
My end goal is to have a picture book on coffee tables of every Korean American or anybody who's interested in Korea. Photography book is not a book that you put it in a bookshelf and not read it. Photography book goes on your coffee table. You look at it and enjoy it every day. And that's what I'm trying to do. So I'm actually looking for sponsors to help me publish this book. I have at least 1 year's worth of, maybe a couple hundred pages worth of pictures that we can publish.
I am curious, though, because you're used to covering live action in a way, photojournalist. Whether it was sports or the riots, you're covering live people moving, you're capturing something in the instant. History, on the other hand, they're stationary, maybe poorly lit. It's a completely different subject matter, I would think. How are you able to bring it to life?
That's the beauty of photography. Yeah, I mean, I've taken pictures. First portrait of George W. Bush when he was elected as president.
The senior?
Yeah. George W.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I've taken pictures at the White House, on Capitol Hill, at the Pentagon. I covered the 9/11 attack at the Pentagon. Yes, when there's lots of movement, there's a one way to show that moment. Even on stationary objects, there are ways you can use lights to bring out the subject. Just visit my website kang.org and check out the pictures. You'll see pictures will say something to you. Yeah, that's the beauty of photography. It's art.
Yes. It's photojournalism, but it's also art, like you say, because it is visual and it's images, right?
Photography with the artistic participation completes the picture.
And like a photo on the cover of a newspaper will make people stop in their tracks, this one hopefully will inspire people to take more interest in learning more about the history behind the photo as well.
For all the Korean Americans and future generations, for hundreds and thousands of years to come, they can look at my pictures and they can clearly see what Korea is.
Honestly, I don't think it's just for Korean Americans, but I think for Koreans as well, for people around the world just interested in the history of Korea and people.
Definition of Korean is anybody who has interest in Korean culture and heritage.
We have another listener, 5624, saying 역사에 대해 공부하고 알리려고 하는 분들이 있어서 정말 다행이라고 생각합니다. 시간이 가면 갈수록 잊혀지는 우리의 역사를 보존할 필요가 있는 것 같아요. Thank you very much, 5624. I hope a lot of our listeners will check out your website, which is once again kang.org. Check out his photos, and if you feel inclined to also support his project as well. Kang Hyungwon-님, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your story.
Thank you for having me.